Well, I've already used the word faith probably 100 times, probably not quite 100, but probably 10 or 15 times. And so let me throw out this, and I'm not really looking for you to give me an answer this morning as much as to think about it in your mind. What is faith? What is faith? We talk about putting our faith in God. We talk about trusting God. We talk about putting our faith in many other things. What is faith? How do we define it? There was a little boy in a Sunday school class once that was asked that question. What is faith? And with a quick flash of an answer, he said, faith is believing something that you know isn't true. Now, it's funny because we laugh because it's a silly statement. If any of us, don't raise your hand because it's on video. Has anybody ever really, in their heart of hearts, believed that? I did at one point. I laugh because it is silly. But there was a point that I probably would have given that definition. Faith is believing something you know isn't true, hoping that someday it'll come to pass. I'm not sure that's as far-fetched as it sounds on the surface. Because I think there are those that believe that. There certainly are those that believe that about Christians. That believe that we place our faith in something that we know isn't true, hoping that it is. I know that there are many that accuse Christians of that. Here's another statement on faith, and I'll throw this out. I'll give you the statement and see if somebody knows where it came from. Okay? Here's the statement. I believe, it's silly, but I believe. Anybody know where that came from? I expected you would, Susan. Put you right on the spot. Those were the well-known words spoken by the young Susan Walker in the popular Christmas movie Miracle on 34th Street. You're into that. That's why I thought you might know that. But you're into that movie, that kind of stuff. but she says, I believe. It's silly, I know, but I believe. And I thought, sometimes we do get the idea that faith is believing in something that we really want to see happen. And there's times that we look at faith as, well, I know it's silly, but I believe anyway. And so there are times that we struggle with faith, and we struggle with what faith is. Hebrews chapter 11 is what we often call the faith chapter in the Bible, because it's a chapter that's all about faith. And in Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 1, the writer says, now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. And what the writer is saying there is that faith is not wishful thinking. Faith is not wishful thinking. Faith is not just hoping in what I'm wishing for and grabbing on to just the possibility that something might take place. Faith, according to that verse, is the inner conviction that we have based on the assurance of the Word of God. Faith is the inner conviction of something that we know is true. I may not see the end result yet, but I know based on fact, based on knowledge, that this is going to take place. That this is something that I can count on. Faith is the conviction based on our knowledge or our assurance of what we know is true. Faith, as I was thinking about faith this week, I believe faith has three important elements. And we're going to get to the message. Probably my actual message will be the last 5 minutes of the whole thing this morning. Because I really think it's important to understand what faith is and then see how God carried that out in some of the things that we see in our road trip through the Bible. Faith, I believe, has three important elements or characteristics. And I believe that all three of these need to be present if it's true faith. One of the elements of faith is knowledge. And I've said that already. Faith is based on knowledge. Faith has an intellectual content. It's based on something that we know is true. Now, let me give an example in Scripture of that. John chapter 20, verses 30 and 31, says, now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. Now it's interesting to me because Jesus never asked his disciples or anybody else to believe something just because he said that it was true. Jesus never came and said, hey, I just want you to believe what I'm telling you. Just accept it and believe it and move on and live it in your life. Jesus never did that. Jesus came, according to John chapter 20 and many other places in the Bible, Jesus came and did all kinds of signs and wonders. He did miracle after miracle. Jesus taught a truth. And then he performed a miracle. And the reason he did that is he did not want his disciples to just accept what he said without evidence for it. And so Jesus did all kinds of miracles to prove that what he was saying is true. And then, as his disciples saw those things, he said, okay, now, believe what I'm telling you. Put your faith in me. Because I'm giving you evidence. I'm giving you fact that you can believe. And so an essential element of faith is knowledge. What we know is right. What we know is true. A second element of faith is assent. Assent. Assent is simply agreeing with the knowledge that we have. Assent is saying, well, here's the evidence, so now I believe that it's true. I've seen the proof, I have the knowledge, now I believe it. I agree with it. Here's a great illustration in John chapter 20. Thomas, of course, we know in the scriptures is doubting Thomas, because all of the other disciples believed in the resurrection of Jesus Christ. But Thomas, and I don't criticize Thomas at all for this, Thomas hadn't seen any evidence. He heard what the others said, but he hadn't seen it. And so Thomas said, I'm not going to believe you. I can't put my faith in something that I don't know whether it's true or not. So, in John chapter 20, beginning of verse 24, now Thomas, one of the 12, called the twin, was not with the other disciples when Jesus came. So the other disciples told him, we have seen the Lord. But Thomas said to them, unless I see his hands and the mark of the nails, and I place my finger in the mark of the nails, and I place my hand into his side, I will not believe. Thomas said, unless I see it myself and know the evidence, I can't put my faith in something that I don't know is true. 8 days later, his disciples were inside again. Thomas was with them. Although the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them and said, peace be with you. Then he said to Thomas, put your fingers here and see my hands. Put out your hand and place it in my side. Do not disbelieve, but believe. Thomas answered, my Lord and my God. Jesus said to him, have you believed because you have seen me? Blessed are those who have not seen and have yet believed. You see, Jesus came and said, okay, Thomas, you said that you wanted evidence. Here it is. Here's my hands. Here's my side. And you can touch it, and you can feel it, and you can do whatever you want. And Thomas, at that point, after seeing the evidence, said, my Lord and my God. Thomas assented to the truth of what he saw by the evidence presented to him through Jesus' hands and side. There was knowledge followed by assent. Yes, I believe. That's the second element, assent. The third element of faith is trust. We know the facts. We assent to the facts. We say, yes, I see the facts and I believe. Trust is the third element. And trust is the action part of it. It's one thing to know that something is true and to believe that it is true. It's another thing to act on it. And action or trust is evidence, is a third element of faith. Don's mother, I quoted Don's mother. Don shared this last week in our Bible study. Don said, my mother always used to say, faith is not believing that God can, but believing that God will. That's trust. I don't only know that God said that He would do something, and I believe that God said that He would do something. Faith is acting on that knowledge. Faith is acting on what we believe. Now, the old illustration, and you've all heard this 100 times, the old illustration is the one of the tightrope walker who said to the crowd of people, how many of you believe that I can push this wheelbarrow across the tightrope that's, over the Grand Canyon, I think. And everybody in the crowd said, I have faith. I believe you can do it. And so then somebody said, okay, who's willing to get in the wheelbarrow? And of course, nobody's willing to do that, right? See, true faith is, I'll get in the wheelbarrow. And that is an element of faith. We have to have fact, we have to believe the facts, and we have to be willing to act on the facts. True faith always leads to action. It always leads us to do something based on the faith that we have. That's the difference between the faith of the demons and Satan and believers. The demons and Satan himself have the facts, and they've assented to the facts. They know that they're true, but they fail to act on those things. As believers, we put our faith in what we know is true, we accept that it's true, and then by trust, we act on our faith. Now let me say this. Faith, the strength of faith, is in the object of faith, not in the faith itself. Let me explain what I mean by that. I can have all the faith in the world in something that is not true, and my faith is going to fail, because it's based in something that's not true. The strength of faith is what it's based in. It's not the faith itself. The strength of faith is what our faith is in the surety of what our faith is in. Now, let me illustrate it, and I thought long and hard on this, so just nod, smile, and agree, and say, that's a great illustration, because you'll make me feel good. But here's the illustration that I thought of. A person, and winter's coming, believe it or not, walking out on ice. Walking out on ice. Every time we walk on ice, we put our faith in the ice. Okay? And now, that faith has three aspects. Number one, knowledge. Knowledge. Okay? I was reading this week, so these are the facts that I found. Less than 2 inches of ice, you need to stay off. Okay? If I put my faith in ice that's that thick, what's going to happen? I have strong faith, I'm going to get wet. I'm going to get wet. Okay? Less than 2 inches, stay off. 4 inches of ice, they say that you can walk and ice fish on. I can walk on a pond with 4 inches of ice with no fear of falling through. 5 inches of ice, I can drive a snowmobile or an ATV on. 8 to 12 inches of ice, you can drive a small car on. 12 to 15 inches of ice, you can put a medium pickup truck on. Those are facts. And so a man that is going to walk on ice goes out, and my father used to take an axe. I'd take an auger because it's quicker. You drill a hole in the ice, and you say, okay, the ice is 5 inches thick. Okay, my knowledge says I can put my faith in that ice. It's 5 inches thick. And the fact is, if it's 5 inches thick, I can go out on that ice and I have no fear of falling through. That's knowledge, that's fact. My assent says, okay, I know that that's true. Probably experience has borne out that that is true. And so my head says, the ice is safe to walk on. I can go out there and fish with no fear of falling through that ice. I assent to that. Now, trust is when I step out on the ice and I go out and I begin to fish. I've taken knowledge, my assent of the knowledge, and I have trusted and acted on that knowledge, and I do so safely because my faith is on something that is true. That's what faith is. Now, the message this morning. God requires of anyone who would follow Him, God requires faith. God requires us to trust Him. And God requires us to act on our faith in Him. In our study, Road Trip Through the Bible, we've seen how God brought the people out of Egypt. We saw last week how God is in the process of leading them to the land that flows with milk and honey. A land that he has promised for generations to give to them. God is leading them. God is taking them there. As they follow the leadership of Moses, God requires that not only Moses and Aaron and Miriam in the leadership of Israel, God not only requires they trust him and that they put their faith in him, God requires that the people live by faith as well. God requires that they trust him. Now, what I want to do briefly is look through all three of those aspects of faith and see how they all were a part of what God required. First of all, knowledge. Knowledge. What kind of knowledge did God give the people that they could put their faith in? Well, I'm going to skip a lot of them, I realize, but I'm going to hit some of the big ones. First of all, his miraculous deliverance from bondage in Egypt. God brought them out of Egypt, and that was, we went through that a number of weeks ago. That was an amazing thing. And the people saw that. They got to the Red Sea, and they were trapped, and the enemy was behind them. And God parted the Red Sea, and they walked through on dry ground. They saw God could do amazing things. It wasn't hearsay. They saw it with their own eyes. They saw God provide food for them to eat. They saw God provide water for them to drink. They saw God defeat their enemy, the Amalekites, who were well armed. And the Israelites had next to nothing. And they saw a miraculous victory in Exodus 17. They saw God come down on Mount Sinai. And God give them his law. And at the same time remind them of all of his promises that I'm going to give you a fruitful land. And as they moved ahead, God gave them all of the knowledge and information that they would ever need to say, man, God is going to do what he said. They had all kinds of knowledge. And now God is asking them to look at all of the evidence, to look at everything that he had done, and say, man, God is going to work. We've seen it. We know it. God said on the deliverance from Egypt, this is going to be the beginning of days for you. You're going to look back at this and say, wow, if God did this, God can do anything. That was the knowledge God gave to them. Now, to stop in that progression for just a minute, what do we have to put faith in today? What has God given us? What kind of knowledge? What kind of evidence? Well, to start with, we have all of the evidence that's presented in the New Testament. That's all presented as an eyewitness account of what Jesus did. It's evidence. It's historical fact. We can believe in that. We can trust in that. We also have the knowledge of Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection. And Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15, if it wasn't for that, our faith would be worthless. There's evidence there. We have experienced God's deliverance as Christians, and we've experienced God's working in our lives. We have seen God answer prayer. We have seen God miraculously meet needs. God has even used the tribulations in our lives to help us to grow and to help us to mature in our relationship with him. God has given us all kinds of evidence that we can trust in our lives in addition to what we have in the Word of God. All of that is knowledge. All of that is fact. And any time that he calls us to act by faith today, it's based on the assurances that he gives us through experience and through the promises in his Word. Our faith, as I've said already, is never based on wishful thinking. It's always based in knowledge. And God gave much knowledge to the children of Israel in which they could lean on and act on. We also see in Israel, they assented to that. They agreed with that. Probably one of the greatest examples is in Exodus 15, after they came through the Red Sea. Moses and the people of Israel sang this song to the Lord. They said, I will sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. The horse and his rider he has thrown into the sea. The Lord is my strength, and he is my song. He has become my salvation. This is my God. I will praise him. My father's God, I will exalt him. The Lord is a man of war. The Lord is his name. They're assenting to say, wow, we have a great God. We've seen him act. We know what he can do. We trust him. We put our faith in him. God now asks the people to trust him. He now says to the people, I want you to act in faith. He put Moses to the faith numerous times. The people grumbled against Moses. Miriam and Aaron grumbled and criticized against Moses. And every time they did that, what did Moses do? He went to the Lord and he said, God, and this is my paraphrase obviously, but God, they're your people. You brought them here. You can provide for them. Moses exercised faith every time. When they needed water, when they needed food, when they needed leadership and guidance, Moses trusted God. Now, in Numbers 13, God is going to put the people's faith to the test. In Numbers 13, in the first 3 verses, Moses sends out spies, the heads of the tribes, those that were in charge. He sends them out as spies, and he says, go out into the land and see firsthand what the land is like. Now, why did God do that? Why did God do that? A couple of things. Number one, he wanted them to see the fruitfulness of the land. He wanted them to go into the land and say, wow, we can't wait to get in here. This is amazing. This is great. He also wanted them to see the enemies of the land. And God wanted them to look at the enemies and say, you know what, they may be big, but my God is bigger. God wanted them to exercise faith. Numbers 13, verses 21 through 24. The spies traveled in the land and they were amazed at what they saw. And we talked about the cluster of grapes already. One cluster was so big it needed to be carried on a pole. That's how fruitful the land was. It was an amazing land. In verses 25 through 29, the spies come back and they give a report to the people. And I thought, wow, the people must have been so excited. They see this pole with grapes on it. And they thought, wow. And the spies said, the land flows with milk and honey. It's fruitful. This is amazing. And the people must have been drooling as they thought about all of those things. And then the spies got to the people in the land. And they said they're big and they're strong. And we're grasshoppers. We're nothing. We're nothing. But then in Numbers chapter 14, some of the spies anyway said, if the Lord delights in us. Actually, I should back up a little bit. When the spies told the people about the people in the land, they decided that they were going to take up stones and kill Moses for leading them there. They said, we can't do anything. They're big, they're strong, and we're weak, and we're small. And in Numbers 14, Joshua, Caleb, Moses said, if the Lord delights in us, he will bring us into the land. He'll give us the land. Only do not rebel against the Lord. Do not fear the people. They're bread for us. They're nothing. Their protection is removed from them because the Lord is with us. You see, the leadership said to the people, you need to have faith. Haven't you seen what God did? Don't you know what God promised? Don't you know that we can trust? And the people said, no, we're afraid. And they said, we're going to stone Moses and Aaron. We're going to stone Joshua and Caleb. We don't want their leadership anymore. And to make a long story short, you know what happened? They never saw the land. They never saw the land. They never saw God defeat their enemies. They never saw the beauty and the fruitfulness of the land apart from that cluster of grapes. They never saw it. Because they failed to put their trust in God. They failed to move ahead in faith. Now let's just apply that to us for a few minutes. In what ways have you and I stepped out on faith? In what ways have we stepped out and said, okay, God, I don't know how this is going to work, but I know that you're going to do something. I know that I can trust you. How have we seen God work? You know, it was challenging to me to sit for a few minutes this week and just look back at my own life and think about ways that, in times, I should say, that I firmly believed in what God was leading, or where God was leading, but I didn't know how. And I thought about those times that I stepped out on faith and trusted God, and there was an element of fear and uncertainty. All of that was there. I'd be lying to say it wasn't. But as I moved ahead in faith, I saw God work. And then I wonder what areas are we struggling to trust God in now? Maybe with family, maybe with church, maybe with friends, maybe with financial issues, maybe with who knows? Who knows? In what areas are we struggling to trust God in? You know, I often hear Christians say something along the lines of, I never seem to see God work. Other people give great testimonies. And I look at my life and I think, what's God doing in me? And I hear people say something along those lines. And my statement or my question is, when somebody says that, when was the last time you stepped out on faith? When was the last time you stepped out on faith? When was the last time you moved ahead with nothing but the assurance of what God said? And I think, for 40 years the children of Israel wandered around the desert and said, where is God? Why did they not see God work? Because they didn't trust Him. They didn't trust Him. They didn't step out on faith. They didn't move ahead. Now, I always have to give a caveat or a warning when I say something like that. We need to have faith in what we know is true. Once in a while I hear somebody say, well, I'm praying that God would do this, and I have faith that He's going to. What they're praying for is not something God ever promised. God never promised health and wealth and a comfortable life. And we can pray for that all we want. And God may give it to us and He may not, but I don't know if He's going to, and we can't claim those things. Once in a while somebody is praying for health. Lord, make me better, make somebody else better, and I'm trusting You. God never promised that we wouldn't get sick. God never promised that we wouldn't lose our lives to sickness. We have to be careful that we're not claiming promises by faith that God didn't give. We need to know what God says. We need to have knowledge of what God says. We need to assent to that knowledge, and we need to act on what we know God says is true. And as we step out on faith, we do so with the assurance that God is going to work. So let's take a moment and bow for prayer. Father, I do thank You for who You are and the fact that we can trust You. Lord, help us to live by faith. And because we live by faith, to step out and to see You working in and through us.